All right. I'm hoping everybody can see this okay. Um, I'll be talking about the underwater world of Point Lobos today, and it's a very unique spot. I have to say, it is or was one of the best dive spots in North America. And it's interesting because in 1960, state lands deeded it over to the state parks 750 subtidal acres, which formed our first underwater reserve in the nation. And since that time, John Pinnicap has become an underwater park. And there are several underwater parks in California, but none really rival Point Lobos and its beauty and diversity. It's really a remarkable place to dive. And I think we have about 5,000 or so divers that come in to Point Lobos each year, which isn't really much compared to the 500,000 visitors that we have. But it's it's a unique area, and it's one that we try best we can by only allowing 15 dive teams to enter the reserve each day. Um, so in order to do a dive at Point Lobos, you have to be certified. You have to show proof of certification and have a buddy and follow all the rules. It's a no-take area, so everything in Point Lobos is protected. Even the airspace above Point Lobos is protected, but underwater it's protected as well as on land. So Point Lobos is really one of the most highly protected places in the world. It's and it deserves it for sure. So we'll get going here. All right. Well, now we're going to get out of our zodiac and drop down into the cold, clear water of Bluefish Cove. And we'll notice as we drop down through the water that the water becomes blue and green, and the color is somewhat muted. And that's because the red end of the spectrum is absorbed by seawater. And as we glance back up through a school of bluefish, we'll be on the bottom. And oftentimes when on the bottom, a harbor seal will come by, especially at this time of year when there's a lot of pups in the water. The pups are really curious and they love to tag along with divers. And I've actually had a pup follow me around and want to get in the boat after a dive, which was kind of I felt like I really wanted to take this little guy home with me, but of course we couldn't. But it's awfully cool to see these guys underwater. And once they get older, they really don't respond much to people. In fact, they stay away from them. But, you know, all young kids and animals are curious. And so we get to see them as we go through our dives oftentimes. One of the things that's really cool, has been cool about Point Lobos is you're diving in a kelp forest. And the kelp is a motel and restaurant to countless organisms. Within the holdfast alone, they've counted, Ed Ricketts actually counted up to 175,000 organisms, not individual species, but organisms. So you can imagine just how important these plants are to the environment from diversity, and it also provides us with oxygen and alginates and a place for fish to hide. Once the kelp breaks up, goes up on the beach, it's broken down by other insects. So there's quite a cycle that goes along with kelp. It's buoyed up to the surface. By these fronds with these little bladders. And these little bladders are full of a carbon gas, and it keeps them up on the surface. Once it's on the surface, it lays out and it forms dense mats in some cases. So when you're in the aquarium looking at the kelp forest, it's really a little bit different than what people see when they're walking around Point Lobos. They see a dense mat of kelp. Well, one of the animals that's really responsible for the protection of Point Lobos is the sea otter. And sea otters number around 3,000 now, but they really can't keep up with the problem that we've got right now with urchins. Otters love to eat urchins. They also eat abalone, but urchins are the thing that it's designed to eat under normal circumstances, and it keeps the urchins, or the otters keep urchins from overpopulating in some cases, but they're not doing it right now, unfortunately, because there's just too many urchins, and I'll get into that in a little bit. The urchin problem is a really unique problem that's going on right now, and it started about 7 years ago with a warm water event called the blob. And when the blob came in, it created a couple of things. One, kelp doesn't like to exist in water that's over 68 degrees, and so the blob began to kill off some of the kelp. It also allowed for a sea star wasting disease to go through the sea stars. And when the sea stars were wiped out, a lot of the sea stars that used to eat both the big urchins and would in larval stages of urchins on the rocks and whatnot, well, those sea stars no longer existed. And I don't think anyone realized exactly how important sea stars were to the environment until they began to be wiped out. And once that happened, then the urchins supposedly came out of hiding. Trillions of them actually came out of hiding from sea stars and began to forage on the bottom and created what we call an urchin barren. These urchins feed voraciously, and even when there's no food for them, they can last for years just in kind of a zombie-like state. I worked with the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service out at San Nicolas Island when the otters were relocated out to San Nicolas, and we studied these 10 different transects around the island. And this is what some of the transects look like. This is what we call an urchin barren. We were counting urchins along with 10 or 12 other species, including a few plants, In some cases, we'd find healthy kelp forests. In other spots, we'd find situations like this. And this is probably what the south shore of Point Lobos looks like now, because it's been invaded by urchins, and it's really a sad situation. I imagine that everything will come back, but it's going to take a long time. A healthy bottom is one that looks like this, and Point Lobos is known for having a lot of diversity. You could probably teach a marine biology class by just looking at this slide. There's so many things here: anemones and tunicates and sea stars and different univalve type animals and algae and sponges. It's just really an incredibly rich place. And at Point Lobos, not 1 square inch of the subtidal substrate, the rock, was not covered with some form of life. And that's what it was before the urchin barrens became prevalent throughout the reserve. It was an extremely rich area, and I'm sure it's extremely rich in some places. There are places where kelp has not really grown all that much. But one of the things that was asked of me about Whalers Cove, because there's still a lot of kelp in Whalers Cove. I wanted to address it in a couple of different ways. There's still a lot of kelp in Whalers Cove, which is sort of an anomaly in the rest of the reserve. But in Whalers Cove, we have these piles of rock, or these small little reefs that occur throughout Whalers Cove. And so you have these little pockets of reef that probably the urchins didn't get to because there was sand around them. It's also it's kind of silty back in there in Whalers. And that may have had some effect on the urchins as well. Whalers Cove gets out to about 90 feet way out at the mouth. And if you go into Whalers Cove and you look at whalers, you'll see a lot of kelp back in the cove. And then you'll see a very sharp line that demarcates where the urchins start and the kelp and stuff was allowed to remain. That's the only explanation I have. So it was another question was asked before the program about the depths of Whalers Cove. Well, the center of Whalers is probably about 35 or 40 feet long, deep, I'm sorry. And the very outside of Whalers Cove is probably in the 90 to 100 foot range. All around the reserve, most of the reserve is within 130 foot range as far as depth goes, with a few exceptions where it goes out to 170 or so. But anyway, these sea stars had a real tough time, and they're now slowly coming back. This is the bat star and an ochre star and a little sculpin, but sea stars are slowly coming back, and I do mean slowly. But the leather star and the bat star are two of the sea stars that kind of graze the bottom. And it's not really known for sure how much they do keep urchins at bay, but we know that they probably do some things. Within a healthy reserve, you also find these big aggregations of ochre stars and these green anemones underneath mussel beds. So underneath a lot of the mussel beds around Point Lobos, where you have a steep wall, where the mussels can drop straight down onto the bottom after otters probably dislodge them while they're feeding, and big waves do the same. And so underneath these mussel areas, these mussel beds, you find giant green anemone, and you find ochre stars who feed on these mussels. And the ochre star is able to open up a mussel about a couple millimeters 3 or 4 millimeters, and then they can put their stomachs inside of the mussel and eat the mussel with their stomachs outside of their bodies in the shells. Pretty unusual way of doing things, but the life underwater is quite a bit different. So back in cracks and crevices, we have these cucumbers, and these are similar to the cucumbers that you might see in the intertidal, ones that are going around and vacuum up the different contents. But these animals are not mobile, and they're found back in cracks and crevices. And this one here, I've only seen at night. And at night, when you shine your light on it, it becomes red. And without the aid of a light or a strobe, all of the animals in the underwater reserve are much more muted. This one actually looks brown, dark brown, until the light goes off and you see the true color of the animal. So all of the images that you see here in my program will be aided by my strobe, with the strobe from my camera, which brings out the color. Another beautiful one is a piperata. It's also attached way back in cracks and crevices. And the one that you probably are familiar with is the warty sea cucumber. This is the one that you see walking around on land and vacuuming up the contents or stuff that's rained down out of the water column. And they could be responsible for eating little urchins as well. So all the stuff in the reserve that is alive there is dependent upon other animals, because the law of numbers really reigns supreme in the underwater world. And so it's important that there's lots of eggs and stuff to be laid and shared. Sponges are ancient creatures. They're ancient animals that have existed for. Hello? I hear somebody talking. If you're not muted, please mute. So these sponges are probably in the neighborhood of 500 million years old. And they were supreme beings for some time, until other animals began to evolve. The sponges are important because they filter a lot of sea water, and in doing so, they take the contents of the seawater, the little microscopic stuff, and the plankton and things like that as well, and eat them, and eventually they will allow the water to go out through their excurrent siphons. And so they have hundreds of these little siphons where they can take water in and then allow it to go back out. And actually they pump hundreds of gallons of water each day. And they're also good food for many of the animals that live in the underwater reserve. I don't see any of these nudibranchs in this slide, but one that's coming up, you'll see that the animals eat the sponges. These are green tennis ball sponges, and then this is an encrusting sponge called a carnus. And over here is a hydrocoral, and we'll look at some hydrocoral later, but hydrocoral is a beautiful colonial animal that you see in the underwater park. But these sponges are encrusting sponges in most cases and protect the surface from being eroded and provide food for many of the animals that are in the underwater reserve. This particular sponge, a carnus, is home to these little nudibranchs down here called rostanga. And rostanga lives on this sponge its whole life, and it consumes the sponge, even becomes orange because of the sponge. And if you look over here at these ribbons, that is the egg cases of these nudibranchs. So everything about this nudibranch is pretty much dependent upon this particular sponge, egg harness. So very, very important creatures these sponges are. Anemones are found from the intertidal out into pretty deep water. And this is a fish-eating anemone, one that's sitting out on a reef waiting for something to pass by. These guys don't move much once they're attached, although they can be moved, but they don't move around very much. They have to wait for passing food. And in a healthy environment, there's a lot of plankton and dead things that are floating around in the water that they will consume. And within the tentacles of all of the anemones and hydroids, you find little nematocysts, which are harpoon-like devices. And they number by the thousands, maybe millions, in the tentacles of these animals. And once a fish or something brushes up against the tentacles of the anemone, they will get bombarded by nematocysts. And if a fish tries to eat them, it gets a mouthful of nematocysts. And these nematocysts are like little microscopic harpoons with a thread on them. So it's a way that these anemones can feed on different things if the food is not passing right over them into their tentacles. Pretty interesting stuff. This one is the beaded anemone, and it has its tentacles reaching out into the water looking for something good to eat. And eventually this particular beaded anemone was able to grab upon this jelly. And this is a moon jelly that it's eating. And it had just stuffed itself with this moon jelly until it became like 3 times its normal size. Very interesting thing. And I guess they must, not eat a lot. So they have to, make do when the time comes. Coreonactus, or the strawberry anemones, are found in big carpets underwater, and they're clones of each one. Each one of these anemones is a clone of the other. So genetically, they're exactly the same. They also host some very potent nematocysts in these little white tips on the tentacles of the Coreonactus. This is, as I mentioned, it's a clone. So it, at some point in its life, it simply divides and walks away from its brother or sister, or whatever you want to call it, and becomes 2. I believe what I caught here is the division of a couple of different, or 2 different anemones are separating here, and eventually, or a anemone will become 2. You also noticed that there's a different color. The one before was more orange or red. This one is more pink. There's one that's a little oranger than this, and one that's closer to blue. So there's 4 different color morphs of these anemones. And as I said before, they're all genetically the same color. Each color is genetically the same. So there's a slight variation genetically in the anemones. In deeper water, we find these Metridium anemones. They can be found in shallow water too, in particular on the Monterey side of the peninsula. You see these growing on the wharf, but off of the aquarium in fairly deep water, we find these, something called the Metridium beds. Got a jet plane going over right now. Sorry for the noise. Not in the flight path, but wow, it's awfully close. So this Metridium anemone can be up to 3.5 or 4 feet tall, making it the tallest of the anemones. And all this brushy stuff out here is designed to take microscopic stuff out of the water and they use it for food, of course. And right over here at the base of this metridium is a giant acorn barnacle. And that acorn barnacle is covered with these zoanthid anemones. And so, like I said before, every square inch of the subtidal reserve was covered with some form of life. The giant green anemones are actually really interesting in that they, like corals in the tropics, are able to utilize algae called zooxanthella, and that zooxanthella is a green algae, and you can see that the green algae has turned this green anemone green, and that algae photosynthesizes sunlight into sugars, and the anemone and the algae benefit from the sugars. Once the anemone is able to find other food and it creates waste products, the algae and the anemone benefit from the waste products of the anemone. And this is a classic symbiotic relationship, one that is interesting and happens all the time in nature. I find the brooded anemone that we're seeing here to be one of the most interesting. And I say that because each one of these little guys here in the middle is a daughter of the parent. And I say a daughter because these little guys will start out as a female. After a period of time, I don't think anyone knows how long that is, they become both male and female and begin to lay eggs. The eggs, once fertile, will be inside the anemone for a while, and eventually they will leave the anemone and walk out like these guys have and start life out, eventually becoming both male and female from being a female at first. So that's pretty interesting stuff when you think about it. What an adaptation. Nudibranchs that you may or may not be familiar with are beautiful animals that have no shell. The nudibranch means naked gills. And so these animals feed on a variety of different substances. This particular one feeds on the tentacles of the tube anemone. The tube anemone is retracted into the tube, which is hard to see, but these guys will come after the tube anemones and graze on the tentacles until it's able to pull back down into the tube, and then it feeds on the tentacles of the anemone and is able to utilize, in some case, the nematocysts. Here's one that looks like the brooding anemone. It's Aeolidia. It looks just like the brooding anemone, feeds on the brooding anemone, and then it'll copulate with another nudibranch, and then it lays eggs. Like the white portion of the slide is all its egg cases. These nudibranchs feed on a variety of different things. They do love sponges, and they do love the tentacles of anemones. This one is Tritonia, and it's very clear, and you can actually see down in through the nudibranch itself. It's highly seasonal as well. You don't see these things until maybe mid to late summer. And then Dirona feeds on bryozoans primarily. And you can see the petals that line the back of the nudibranch, Dirona, are its respiratory organs and a place for it to store tissue and things of that nature. And again, this one is seasonal too, and it's also found in pretty deep water, so you don't see it all the time. This one is Hopkins rose, and we find this comes up during El Niños, during warm water periods that you guys have probably all heard about. It also feeds on bryozoans, which this red stuff is, and it feeds on the zoanthids of the bryozoans. It gets its name, the Hopkins Rose, from the Hopkins Marine Station where it's once studied. But we don't see this all year. And sometimes we don't see nudibranchs for a while. We don't know what happens to them. And we don't know a lot about what happens to animals that disappear seasonally and reappear. Another big mystery. This particular one is like the next one that I'll show you is it's called Fidiana, and it's a nudibranch that utilizes the nematocyst almost primarily along with the tissue of the anemones that it feeds upon. And once the animal, the nudibranch, has fed upon the tentacles of the anemones or hydroids, it channels the nematocyst up into the serrata, which is the orange things, these little protuberances on the back of the anemone. It channels them up into the back, the serrata. That serrata becomes loaded with nematocysts, which actually fire into the mouths of fish if the fish try to eat it. This is Hermacinda, very much like Fidiana from the slide previous. It also does the same thing that Fidiana does. It channels nematocysts back up into the serrata. It coats them with mucus, so they don't bother the nudibranch. Once that all these nematocysts are loaded with, or all these serrata are loaded with nematocysts, it makes it pretty much inedible to fishes or other animals for that matter. And it also, this one is unique in itself because it creates acid that is able to spit into the mouths of fishes if the serrata don't do the job in warding off a suitor, so to speak. Chromodorus is one that feeds on this particular sponge. It's the cobalt blue sponge. And Chromodorus I've seen one time only, and that was a night dive. And that's this picture here. And we don't know a whole lot about this guy, except that it does feed on the this particular cobalt blue sponge. Gorgeous animal. I'd like to have seen more of them. Not Chromodorus, but this Dorid nudibranch is one that you see in the tide pools pretty often. It's called the speckled sea lemon. And it's a Dorid nudibranch. And the Dorids, when they are mating, they exchange sperm by rubbing their shoulders up against each other. And I can hear everybody laughing now. Yeah, they rub their shoulders on one another, exchange sperm, and eventually once that whole process is complete, they lay eggs. And these eggs are the product of the Dorid anemones copulating and then laying eggs. And the eggs are not bad to eat, evidently, for fishes and whatnot, but the nudibranchs themselves either taste bad or they have these interesting defenses with the nematocysts. The chemical defenses normally would keep them from eating the nudibranchs, but the eggs are pretty much fair game. And that's the way nature is pretty much underwater. Each animal lays a lot of eggs, and all the animals are pretty much independent or dependent upon each other. So the nudibranchs are a mollusk without a shell. And so we'll now talk a little bit about the snails that have shells. And they love sponges as well. And you can see that this top snail has been grazing on this particular orange brain sponge. And there's another top snail that's feeding on a different kind of sponge, but you can see the tracks of the animal where the animal has been feeding. So the sponges are quite important to the small animals that are able to eat them. Some of the snails, of course, would be carnivores and also herbivores. This is an herbivore. It feeds on algae, and right now it's on the stipe of a bull kelp, feeding on that particular kelp. You can see the little eye right here. This is another animal that otters really like to eat too. There's a fair amount of meat in there. And chestnut cowries, another snail that we see somewhat seasonally, although we're starting to see it more regularly now on a regular basis as the water is warming up. And a lot of the animals are moving north now. This is one that we only saw during El Niños, but I've been told that there's these guys are year-round out in the outer pinnacles in Carmel Bay. Worms are just like in your garden. They're polychaetes. They are found throughout the marine reserve, usually within a tube. Most of the worms are tube-dwelling animals that either are made up of very dense calcium carbonate to make the tube, or they make them with calcium carbonate, and they're more like kind of a mud tunnel. But this one is feeding with, you can see all of the, its respiratory organ is out feeding in the water column. And it's nestled down amongst a large number of bryozoans. All these animals on the outside of the worm are bryozoans. Each type of worm is slightly different. This one doesn't have anything to protect it once it's inside of its tube. And its tube actually is kind of leathery and soft, but it's able to withdraw way down into its tube and find safety there. It also is so fast that just a little bit of a shadow going over it creates enough time for the worm to go back down into its tube. And another thing that's interesting here is each one of these little hairs is a feeding animal. It's kind of an unusual organism, and I don't know all the life history about it, but it's made up of thousands of individuals that live on these stalks that are mutually dependent upon one another. The tunicates that we find underwater are actually relatives of ours. These guys are called light bulb tunicates. They look like light bulbs. And you can see the ancient notochord that is like a spinal cord. And I say that they're relatives of ours because each one of these has the remnant of a spinal cord. So they're in the same phylum as we are, Chordata, although there is a slight difference in that they're in a phylum called Urchordata, but it's essentially the same. If you take a human embryo and egg, or a human egg and sperm meeting, place it on a slide, you wouldn't be able to tell the difference. The naked eye wouldn't be able to tell the difference between the two. We're so closely related early in our life history. This is a group of colonial tunicates around a solitary tunicate, and then this is a bat star over here on the side feeding right next to them. So the tunicates are very beautiful little creatures. We also have a fair number of animals that are like corals and are related to corals. The cup corals, these orange cup corals that look like anemones, are actually the polyps of an individual coral. And the polyps, these polyps are way bigger than the ones that you would see in the tropics. But these are one of our only true corals that we see up farther in the water column. A lot of corals, soft corals, are found way down deep, but these guys are found up in areas where people dive. And each one of these little polyps is loaded with nematocysts. So I mentioned that the anemones and the hydroids and the corals have nematocysts that they're able to defend themselves with. And there's another cobalt blue sponge right in the middle and over here on the side. There's also one other cup coral that's brown, and you'll see it later in the program during a musical segment that I have in store for you guys. Oh, I'm sorry. This is the brown cup coral. And you can see the little nematocysts in the tentacles. And it's sort of sitting in a bed of tunicate, colonial tunicate. Hydrocorals are one of the things I wanted to see most when I first started diving at Point Lobos. I came from a reservoir in Northern California and jumped at the opportunity to come down to Point Lobos and work with the underwater parks people. And I did quite a bit of work with the underwater parks people and loved diving and seeing hydrocoral because it's so cool. It looks like coral, but it's actually it's not quite like coral. It does have a stony skeleton that it lives in. And in Point Lobos, we have 4 different colors of this animal. Here's 3 here, but as far as I know, there's no places other than Point Lobos and maybe some places very close to it that have 4 different color morphs of hydrocoral. Gorgeous creatures. They're long-lived. They also take a long time to grow. They say about 1/5 of an inch a year is all it takes. And you can see that this colony is many, probably hundreds of years old. The hydrocoral like to orient themselves into the most passing current so that they can get the most food, because they have to rely on food that drifts by them, whether it's microscopic or little tiny stuff that drifts by. They collect it as it's adrift. Here's a big group of strawberry anemones here. Getting into deeper water still, we come upon gorgonians. And the gorgonians are branch-like animals related to corals. And you can see that it has polyps as well. Each one of these little guys here is a polyp that come off of the branches. And we don't see these animals until we get into about 90 to 100 feet of water. So you can't plan on seeing these animals, at least in Carmel Bay, until you get into deep water. In the tropics and even in Southern California, these grow up in closer to the surface. But it's so diverse and there's so much competition amongst the animals in Point Lobos that I think this animal has to live in deep water to avoid being fouled by other organisms. Well, my dive partner has come over and he showed me his gauges. And although he's got plenty of air left, we've been down to 110 feet of water. And we've been down long enough so that we need to make a stop on the way up. So we're going to go ahead and head up to a line we've got tied off on the boat and hang out for 15 minutes, letting the nitrogen leave our bodies. But before we leave, our old friend, the harbor seal, comes back to say hello, or goodbye, that is, sorry. And so I hope you've learned a little bit about the underwater reserve at Point Lobos, and how complicated life is underwater. So thank you guys. And I'd be open to questions if you have some. I'm not quite sure how to go about doing that.
Hi, Jerry. So there are questions in the chat, so I'll just start going down them, and anyone who has a question after that, just chime in.
Okay.
We'll start with Gwen's question. Do we know what caused the blob, climate change, or a specific event?
Climate change. Yeah.
The warming of the water?
Yep. It was climate change related, and all the cascade of stuff that came down afterwards is a product of climate change.
Okay, thank you. And then John asks if the abalone are recovering at Point Lobos.
I don't know. I think abalone in general is recovering, but the ones you see are back in cracks and crevices that otters can't get. So probably to some degree they are, but they're probably been grazed down by otters, and mainly by otters, to a level that's more consistent with the way nature would like it, because nature doesn't like overpopulations of any one animal, and it likes biodiversity. So we would never have gotten to know what abalone tasted like if the otter hadn't been wiped out in the early 1800s, because that gave the abalone and urchins time to grow completely out of balance to unbelievable numbers.
Interesting. So then Wendy asks, can nudibranchs be seen at low tide at Weston Beach?
Sure. Yeah. You'll see Hermescinda and then some of the Dorids that you see I had in the program. Yep, you can on a low tide.
Low tide. Are you aware of any good guidebooks that focus on these creatures that are specific to Monterey Bay or specific to Point Lobos?
Yeah, well, not necessarily specific to Point Lobos, but there's a couple really good ones by Dan Gottschall. He was a fish and game biologist. He wrote one on fishes and subtitle invertebrates of maybe of California or something like that. And those books do a good job of showing you the fishes that we have here and the invertebrates as well.
Oh, fun. Do you wear a dry suit when you're diving at Point Lobos?
I wore a dye suit, yes and no. I would wear a dry suit if I was going to be making multiple dives. But generally I would wear a wetsuit for just one dive. But if you're going to be down for a while, a dry suit is kind of nice to have. They're kind of bulky though and cumbersome. You can't swim nearly as easily as you could with just a wetsuit. So I wasn't thrilled with the dry suit I had, but I did rely on it from time to time, for sure.
Are scuba tanks and electric underwater propellers allowed in Whalers Cove?
Yes, they are. If you want to dive with a scuba tank, you have to show that you're certified to dive, though. Yeah.
What would it be an example of an underwater propeller? I don't know what that would be. I'm trying to figure that out.
Underwater propeller?
Is that like a boat? Like so
You like a boat propeller?
That's what I'm guessing. Wendy, is that what are you? I'm guessing she's asking about whether the boats with propellers are allowed.
Yeah, they are. Yeah, the water is navigable.
Mhm. Visitors ask if there are any sunken ships or interesting relics under the water at Whalers. Do you know of any?
There is one, I think, that we found. I found a pile of ballast, which is what the old boats would use as ballast, as rocks. And I found a ballast pile out off of Guillemot Island that I believe I think was part of the Star of the West. It's a 1845 pre-gold ship, pre-gold rush ship that went down. I'm having trouble talking this morning. So yeah, there are some, but there's really nothing left of any of them, except maybe a ballast pile here and there.
Interesting. What are the most common types of fish in Whalers Cove?
Well, they'd be the rockfishes, bluefish, yellowtail rockfish, and then lingcod are fairly common. Senoritas, mostly the rockfishes are there.
Great. And Wendy, she went ahead and clarified what she was, electric underwater handheld scooter that assists the diver to navigate, which sounds like something that I would need.
Yes, they're allowed.
Okay, wonderful. Thank you, Wendy. For us non-divers, I'm like, what are those? There's several messages to say thank you, Jerry.
Okay.
But this is absolutely fascinating, as you always are, but it's just between the photos and your knowledge, we're just really enjoying it.
Oh, thank you.
Yeah,
Thank
yeah,
you.
like Sherry, I want to become a diver now.
Well, you can do it.
Oh, that's great. Does anyone have any other questions for Jerry? If you do and you don't think of it right away, always feel free to send me an email. I can get it to Jerry and we can get your questions answered. Sometimes we don't think about things until we're mulling it over later. And I will send out this recording to everyone, and please feel free to share it with your family and your friends, someone you might find the topic interesting, which I think would be just about everyone. So let's see if there's any more. No, a lot of thank yous. Fabulous presentation. Everyone's really enjoying it. I really appreciate you doing this, Jerry. It's just such an honor to have you present for us.
Oh, you're so welcome. I'm happy to do it and glad everybody enjoyed it.
Oh, yes, absolutely. Absolutely. Well, thank you, everyone. Thank you so much. You get applause.
Thank you.
Applause. Thank you, everyone, for being here. So nice to see some of your faces on the screen. Thank you again for supporting the foundation. It's an honor to present this and thank you in this way and bring you a little closer to Point Lobos. Even those who are far